The Dawn Flows Home to the Sea, Part 1, by Mikhail Sholokhov, continued. Chapter 9. A week later, the front had completely dissolved. The first to leave the front open was the 28th Regiment, in which Pyotr Melyakov was serving. After secret negotiations with the command of the enemy opposite them, the Cossacks resolved to retire and to let the Red Army pass without hindrance through the territory of the Upper Don region. Yakov Fomin, a narrow-minded and short-sighted Cossack, was the leader of the insurgent regiment. But in reality, Fomin was only a dummy, and behind him a group of Bolshevik-minded Cossacks directed the movement. After a stormy meeting in which the officers, fearing a bullet in the back, reluctantly urged the necessity of continuing the struggle, while the Cossacks vigorously, insistently, and unorganizedly shouted that the war was unnecessary and that peace should be made with the Bolsheviks, the regiment began to retreat. At the end of the first day's march, the commander and the majority of the officers abandoned the regiment and attached themselves to another brigade. Following the example of the 28th Regiment, the 36th Regiment also abandoned its positions. It arrived at Kazanska in its full complement, including its officers. Surrounded by horsemen, the commander rode up to the house where the district commandant was quartered, dismounted, and entered with a swashbuckling air, playing with his whip. "Who is the commandant here?" he demanded. "I am his assistant." Stepan Astachov rose and said with dignity, "Shut the door." "I'm the commander of the 36th Regiment. My name's Naumov. I have the honor. I have got to equip my men with new clothes and boots. They are ragged and barefoot. Do you hear? The commandant is not here, and without his authority I cannot hand out a single pair of boots from the stores." "What?" "That's what." "You? Whom are you talking to? I'll arrest you, damn you. At him, lads. Where is the key to the stores, you rear rat?" The officer banged on the table with his whip and, paling with frenzy, thrust his fur cap back on his head. "Give me the key and no arguing." Within half an hour, bundles of fur jackets, felt boots, leather boots were flying through the store's door onto the snow, and bags of sugar were passing from hand to hand. A noisy and merry babel of voices arose on the square. Meantime, the 28th Regiment, with its new commander, Sergeant Fomin, had retreated as far as Vyashenska district. 20 miles behind them came the divisions of Red Guards, pouring through the 70-mile gap in the northern front. For a whole week there was an unusual quiet in the north. There was no sound of gunfire. The machine guns were silent. Disheartened by the defection of the 28th Regiment, the Cossacks of the lower Don district were retreating without fighting. The Reds advanced cautiously, slowly, their advance patrols carefully reconnoitering the villages lying ahead of them. During those days of disintegration, the hostility which even during the imperialist war had divided the Cossacks from their officers by an invisible furrow developed to unprecedented dimensions. At the end of 1917, when the Cossack regiments had been slowly flowing back to the Don, instances of murder and betrayal of the officers were rare, but a year later they had become an almost everyday incident. The Cossacks compelled their officers to imitate the Red Army commanders and to go in front when advancing, then quietly shot them in the back. With his crafty, quick-witted mind, Pyotr Melyakov had long before this realized that to argue with the Cossacks was to invite death for himself, and from the earliest days of the revolt he had carefully worked to break down the barriers separating him, an officer, from the rank and file. Like them, he talked on convenient occasions of the uselessness of the war, speaking insincerely and with great difficulty, but not being found out. He began to paint himself in Bolshevik colors, and as soon as he saw that Yakov Fomin was coming to the leadership of the regiment, began deliberately to worm his way into his good graces. Like the rest, Pyotr was not slow to curse the officers and to spare the prisoners, although in his heart he was filled with hatred, and his hands trembled with the desire to strike and kill them. Thus he managed to win the Cossacks' confidence, and to change his features before their very eyes. When the commander of the regiment led off the other officers, Pyotr remained behind. Peaceable and quiet, always keeping himself in the background, restrained in all his behavior, he arrived with the regiment at Vyshchenska. But after spending 2 days there, he could hold out no longer, and without reporting to the staff or to Fomin, he fled home. That day, a meeting had been going on since early morning in Vyshchenska Market Square outside the old church. The regiment was waiting for the arrival of delegates from the Red Army. The Cossacks wandered in droves over the square, dressed in greatcoats, short fur jackets, and coats fashioned from overcoats, or in woolen padded coats. It was impossible to believe that this enormous nondescript mob was the 28th Regiment. Pyotr wandered despondently from one group to another, studying the Cossacks. At the front he had not been struck by the style of their dress. For that matter, he had not previously seen the entire regiment in one compact mass. Now, hatefully biting the ends of his mustache, he stared at their heads with their strange assortment of fur caps, hats, and cowls. He looked at their bodies and saw as rich a variety of felt boots, and leg rags, wound above short boots taken from Red Guards. Ragged bums, damned lot of peasants, degenerates, he muttered to himself in impotent anger. Not one of Vyshchenska's inhabitants was to be seen on the streets. The entire place was in expectant hiding. The white breast of the snow-swept dawn showed through the gaps of the cross-alleys, with the forest beyond looming black as though etched in India ink. Around the gray stone pile of the church, the women come from the villages to visit their husbands were huddled like a flock of sheep. Pyotr, dressed in a fur-lined jacket with an enormous pocket on the chest, and wearing that accursed officer's Astrakhan cockade, of which he recently had been so proud, continually felt sidelong, cold glances fixed on him. They deepened his already anxious, distracted mood. He stood listening for a while to a Red Army man in a greatcoat of good quality and a new fur cap, who was standing on a barrel in the middle of the square. With his fur-gloved hand, the man adjusted the scarf about his neck and looked around him. "Comrade Cossacks!" The low, chilly voice entered Pyotr's ears. Pyotr looked about him and noticed that the Cossacks, troubled by the unusual word comrade, were staring at one another agitatedly. The Red Army man talked for a long time about the Soviet government, the Red Army, and relations with the Cossacks. He was continually being interrupted by shouts. "Comrade, what do you mean by commune? And what is the Communist Party?" The speaker pressed his hand against his chest and patiently explained, "Comrades, the Communist Party is a voluntary affair. The party is joined of their own free will by those who want to struggle for the great task of liberating the workers and peasants from the oppression of the capitalists and landowners." Almost immediately there was a shout from someone else. "Explain to us about communists and commissars." Hardly had the man finished his explanation when a further shout arose. "We don't understand what you're talking about. We're ignorant people here. Use simpler words." When the Red Army man had finished, Yakov Fomin made a long and boring speech. As he listened, Pyotr recalled the first time he had seen Fomin in the army, when Darya had visited him at the station on the way to Petrograd. Before his eyes appeared the stern, moistly gleaming eyes of the deserter from the Ataman regiment, the greatcoat with the number 52 on the shoulder straps, and the man's bearish walk. "Couldn't stand any more, brother," Pyotr remembered the words. "A deserter, a fool like Christonia, and now he's the commander of the regiment, and I'm left out in the cold," Pyotr thought, his eyes glittering bitterly. He turned and walked swiftly towards his quarters. He saddled his horse, listening as the Cossacks riding away from Vyshchenska fired their rifles in accordance with immemorial custom, announcing the return of servicemen to their villages. Chapter 10. The terrifying, still, short days seemed longer than those of harvest time. The villages lay like the untrodden virgin steppe. It was as though all the Dawnside districts had died, as though a pestilence had laid waste the district settlements, and it was as though clouds had covered all the Dawn region with their black, opaque wings, spreading silently and terribly, until a wind should send the poplars bending to the earth. A dry, crashing peal of thunder should burst and march to crush and shatter the white forest beyond the dawn, to send the savage stones leaping from the chalky hills and roar with the destructive voice of thunder. Since morning a mist had enveloped Tatarsk and the steppe. A roaring in the hills presaged a frost. By noonday the sun had peeled out of the clinging mist, but it grew no lighter. The mist aimlessly wandered over the heights of the Dawnside hills, huddled into the cliffs and perished there, settling a white dust over the mossy slopes of chalk and on the bare, snowy ridges. In the evening the red-hot shield of the moon arose from beyond the roots of the naked forest. It mistily sowed the bloody seeds of war and incendiary fire over the silent villages. And in its miserable, faded light, an inarticulate alarm was born in the hearts of men. The animals fidgeted anxiously. The horses and bullocks could not sleep and wandered about the yards until dawn. The dogs howled balefully, and the cocks began to crow one against another long before midnight. Their stirrups and weapons clattering, an invisible mounted army might have been marching down the left bank of the Don through the dark forest and the gray mist. Almost all the Tatarsk Cossacks who had been on the northern front had returned to the village, abandoning their regiments as they slowly retreated towards the dawn. Some came back to unsaddle their cavalry mount for many days, and to await the arrival of the Reds, thrusting their military equipment into a rick of straw or under the eaves of a shed. But others only led their horses into the yard, spent the night with their wives, and next morning, replenishing their stock of provisions, rode off again along the steppe tracks, looking back for the last time from the hilltop down on the white, dead sweep of the dawn, and on their native village, left maybe forever. Who goes to meet death? Who can guess the end of the human road? With difficulty the horses moved away from the village. With difficulty the Cossacks tore sorrow for their dear ones out of their chilling hearts. And over that road many returned in thought to their homes. Along it many heavy thoughts were pondered, and maybe tears as salt as blood slipped over the saddle, down from the stirrup to the hoof-marked road. The night after Pyotr arrived from Vyashenska, there was a family council in the Melyukov hut. "Well, what's this?" Panteleimon asked as soon as Pyotr crossed the threshold. "Had enough of fighting? Come back without your officers' epaulets? Well, go and shake hands with your brother and mother. Cheer them up. Your wife's almost dead with longing for you. Bravo, bravo, Pyotr. Griegor, what are you lying on the stove like a marmot for? Come on down." Griegor let his bare legs hang, and, smilingly scratching his hairy chest, watched as his brother unfastened his sword-belt with fingers stiff with cold, and fumbled with the knots of his cowl strings. Darya smiled speechlessly into her husband's eyes, and unbuttoned his sheepskin jacket, carefully avoiding his right side, where a hand grenade was fastened to the belt close to the revolver holster. Brushing her brother's mustache with a kiss as she passed, Dunya ran out to see to his horse. Ilinichna wiped her lips with her apron and prepared to kiss her firstborn. Natalia bustled about at the stove, her children clinging to her skirt. Everybody waited for Pyotr to speak, but he merely threw a hoarse "good health" to them from the threshold, and removed his outer clothes in silence, spending much time brushing his boots with a millet-straw broom. Then, straightening up, his lips suddenly trembled. He distractedly leaned against the head of the bed, and all saw the tears shining on his frozen, darkened cheeks. "Here, soldier, what's the matter?" his father asked, concealing his alarm beneath a jest. "We're finished, father." Pyotr's mouth writhed, his bleached eyebrows quivered, and hiding his eyes he blew his nose into his dirty palm. Griegor knocked away the cat, rubbing itself against him, and with a groan jumped down from the stove. His mother burst into sobs and kissed Pyotr's lousy head, but immediately tore herself away from him. "My dear, my poor boy, shall I get some sour milk for you? Go and sit down, your soup's getting cold. You're hungry, I'm sure." At the table, dangling his nephew on his knees, Pyotr cheered up. Mastering his agitation, he told of the withdrawal of the 28th Regiment from the front, the flight of the officers, of Fomin, and the last meeting he had attended in Vyazhenska. "What do you think about it all?" Griegor asked, his hand resting on his daughter's head. "There's nothing to think about. I'll spend tomorrow at home and ride off when night comes. Get me some victuals ready, Mother." He turned to her. "You're clearing out, that means?" Panteleimon thrust his fingers into his tobacco pouch and remained standing with a pinch of tobacco between them, awaiting Pyotr's reply. Pyotr rose, crossed himself, and stared at him harshly and bitterly. "Christ save me, I've had enough. Clearing out, you say? And what else? Why should I stay behind? To have the red bellies cut my block off? Maybe you're thinking of staying here, but I'm not. They'll have no mercy on officers. And what of your home? So you're deserting it?" Pyotr merely shrugged his shoulders at his father's question, but Darya at once gave tongue. "You're going off and we've got to remain? That's fine, I must say. We'll stay behind to watch over your interests, and lose our lives because of you, maybe. You be damned, I'm not staying." Even Natalia intervened in the discussion. Out-shouting Darya's ringing recitative, she exclaimed, "If the village is touched, we won't stay. We'll go on foot." "You fools! Stupid bitches!" Panteleimon roared in a frenzy, rolling his eyes and involuntarily looking for his stick. "Shut your mouths, you she-devils! This is a man's business, and you're poking your noses in. Well, and supposing we do leave everything and go where our feet take us, what shall we do with the cattle? Put them in our pockets? And the hut, too?" "You're touched, my girls," Ilinichna spiritedly supported her husband. "You haven't had to work to build up the farm, and it's easy for you to leave it. But I and the old man have toiled day and night, and we're not going to clear out." She pressed her lips together and sighed. "You go, but I'm not moving from here. Better to be killed on your own threshold than to die under a stranger's whip." For a minute there was a general silence. Then Dunya, who was knitting a stocking, raised her head from her work and said in a whisper, "We can drive the cattle with us. We needn't stay behind because of the cattle." Again the old man flamed up. Like a stallion kept long in the stables, he stamped his feet, all but falling as he stumbled over a kid lying by the stove. Halting in front of Dunya, he roared, "We'll drive them? And the old cow? What of her? Where will you drive her to? May your sins choke you, you foster child, you nitwit. Coddled her, and then we have to listen to that. And the sheep? What will you do with the lambs, you daughter of a bitch? Better hold your tongue." Griegor glanced sidelong at Pyotr, and, as in the old days, saw in his brother's eyes a mischievous, quizzical, and simultaneously respectful smile, and noticed the familiar twitch of his wheat-colored mustache. Pyotr swiftly winked. His body shook with restrained laughter. Joyously, Griegor realized his own desire for laughter, so unfamiliar of recent years, and he openly laughed deeply and thunderously. "Well, there. Praise be. We've been talking—" The old man gave him an angry look and sat down with his face turned to the frosted window. Only at midnight did they come to the general agreement that the 3 Cossacks were to clear out of Tatarsk, while the women were to remain behind to watch over the hut and the farm. Ilinichna lit the stove long before sunrise, and by morning she had baked bread and dried 2 bags of rusks. The old man had his breakfast by the stove, and at dawn went out to collect the cattle and to get the sledge ready for departure. He stood a long time in the granary, his hand thrust into the full corn bin, letting the grains of wheat trickle through his fingers. He went out as though he were leaving a corpse, removing his cap and shutting the door quietly behind him. He was still bustling around the sledge under the shed when Anikushka appeared in the street, driving his cow down to drink. The two men greeted each other. "Going to clear out, Anikushka?" Panteleimon asked. "Aye, clear out? Belt a naked man? What I have is inside me." "Any news?" "A great deal, Prokofitch." "What?" Panteleimon grew anxious and thrust his axe into the side of the sledge. "The Reds will be here soon. They're getting near Vyashenska. A man from Bolshoi Gromok saw them and said they're killing people as they come. There are Jews and Chinese among them." "Killing people? As soon as smell them." Anikushka cursed and moved on, talking as he walked. "The women of the villages are making vodka and giving it to them to drink so that they won't harm them. And then they get drunk, go on and capture the next village and run amok." The old man looked around the shed, noting every post and wattle set up by his own hands. Then he went to the threshing floor to get hay for the journey. He took down an iron hook, and, still not realizing the inevitability of departure, began to drag out the poorer hay. He always kept the better for use during the spring plowing. But he changed his mind, and, angry with himself, went to another rick. It did not occur to him that within a few hours he would be leaving the yard and the village and driving somewhere to the south, and maybe would never return. He pulled down some hay, and again, out of habit, turned to rake up the scattered wisps. But he drew his hand back as though the rake were hot, and wiping his sweaty brow, said aloud, "What should I look after it for now? All the same, it'll be flung under their horses' feet. They'll eat it or burn it." His old legs dragging, his back bowed, he grated his teeth and picked up the fork of hay. He did not go into the hut, but shouted through the open door, "Get ready! I'll be harnessing the horses in a minute. We'd better not be late in starting." He put the body harness over the horses, dropped a sack of oats into the back of the sledge, and, astonished that his sons had not yet come out to saddle their horses, went into the hut. In the kitchen a strange sight met his eyes. Pyotr was furiously untying the bundles prepared for their departure and throwing trousers, tunics, and women's holiday ornaments on the floor. "What's all this?" the old man asked in utter amazement, even removing his cap. "It's them." Pyotr pointed his finger across his shoulder at the women. "They're grumbling. They never go anywhere. If one's going, all ought to go, or none at all. They're saying the Reds may force them, and we're going away to save the property, and if they kill them, they'll die and be done with it." "Take your things off, Father." Griegor smilingly removed his own greatcoat and cap, while weeping Natalia caught at his hand and kissed it from behind, and Dunya joyously clapped her hands. The old man put on his cap, but took it off again at once, and, walking across to the icons, crossed himself with a great sweeping gesture. He bowed thrice, then rose from his knees and looked around. "Well, if that's the case, we stay. Queen of Heaven, cover and defend us. I'll go and unharness the horses." Anikushka happened to drop in, and was astonished to see all the Melyukov family with laughing, cheerful faces. "What's the matter?" he asked. "Our Cossacks aren't going away," Darya replied for them all. "Well now, thought better of it?" "Thought better of it." Griegor reluctantly laid bare his teeth and winked. "No point in going out to look for death. It'll find us here." "If the officers aren't going, then God has commanded us also what to do," Anikushka exclaimed, and he clattered out of the hut as though wearing horseshoes. Chapter 11. The decision to remain behind, after all, brought Panteleimon renewed strength and a sense of proportion. In the evening he went out to see to the cattle, and unhesitatingly chose hay from the poorer rick. In the darkening yard he examined the cow carefully from all sides, and satisfiedly thought, "She's getting very fat. Has the Lord blessed her with twins?" A few minutes later he was grumbling at Dunya because she had spilt chaff about and had not broken the ice in the trough. He asked Aksenia, who had run out to close the shutters of their hut, whether Stepan was thinking of clearing out. Wrapping herself in her kerchief, Aksenia answered in a sing-song voice, "No, no, where could he go to? He's lying on the stove with some sort of fever. His head's burning. He's fallen sick and he can't go away." "And we aren't going either. The devil knows whether it's for better or worse." Night fell. Beyond the dawn, beyond the gray gulf of forest, the pole star glowed in the greenish depths of the heavens. In the east the sky was enveloped in purple. The sunset burned in the west. The hump of the moon emerged from the spreading horns of the poplars. The shadows deepened against the snowdrifts. It was so quiet that Panteleimon could hear someone breaking the ice in the ice-hole by the dawn. The lamp was lit in the hut. Natalia slipped between the light and the window. Panteleimon was drawn towards the warmth. He found all the household gathered inside. Dunya had just returned from a visit to Christonia's wife. She emptied the cup of leaven she had borrowed and, afraid of being interrupted, hurriedly told the latest news. In the best room, Griegor greased his rifle, revolver, and sword, wrapped his field glasses in canvas, and then called Piotra. "Have you collected your arms?" he asked. "We must hide them. But supposing we want to defend ourselves?" "It would be wiser to be quiet," Griegor laughed. "If they find them, they'll hang us by our trousers at the gate." They went into the yard. For some inscrutable reason, they hid their weapons separately. But Griegor had thrust his new black revolver under the pillow of his bed. They had hardly finished supper, and were getting ready for bed when the dog, chained in the yard, began to bark hoarsely, pulling on its chain and choking itself in the collar. The old man went out to see what was the matter, and returned with someone wearing his cowl well down over his eyes. The man, who was in full military uniform, entered, crossing himself. A cloud of steam came from his frosted mustache. "Don't you know me?" he asked. "Why, it's Cousin Makar!" Darya exclaimed. Only then did Piotra and the others recognize their distant relative, Makar Nogaitsev, a Cossack of Singin village, well known throughout the district for his good voice and his drunken bouts. "What's brought you here?" Piotra smiled, without moving from where he was standing. Nogaitsev pulled an icicle from his mustache and threw it down by the door, stamped his feet in his great felt boots, and unhurriedly began to remove his outdoor clothes. "It's unpleasant clearing out by myself, so I thought I'd come and call for you. I heard both the brothers were at home, so I told my wife I'd go and collect the Myelyakovs, and then the party would be merrier." He unshouldered his rifle and set it down at the stove alongside the forked oven poles, raising a laugh from the women. He thrust his pack under the oven, but carefully laid his sword and whip on the bed. As usual, his breath smelt of homemade vodka, and his eyes had a drunken look in them. "Are all the Cossacks clearing out of Singin?" Griegor asked, holding out his tobacco pouch. The guest pushed his hand away. "No, thanks, I don't smoke. The Cossacks? Some have cleared off, and others are looking for somewhere to hide themselves. Are you going off?" "Our Cossacks aren't going away. Don't you try to get them to," Ilinichna said in alarm. "You're not staying behind, surely?" "I can't believe it. Cousin Griegor, is that true? You're asking for trouble, brothers." "What is to be?" Piotra sighed, and suddenly flushing, he asked, "Griegor, what do you think? You haven't changed your mind. Shall we go?" "Not now." A wreath of tobacco smoke enveloped Griegor and hung about his curly head. "Shall father see to your horse?" Piotra asked Makar inconsequentially. The long silence was disturbed only by the sound of the distaff droning as Dunya spun. Nogaitsev sat on till dawn, trying to persuade the brothers to ride with him beyond the Donets River. During the night, Piotra ran out twice to saddle his horse, but each time, driven back by Darya's menacing eyes, went to unsaddle it again. Daylight came, and the guest made ready to depart. When he was fully dressed, he stood with his hand on the latch, coughed meaningly, and said with a hidden menace in his voice, "Maybe your way is the better, but you may change your minds after. If we ever come back, we shall remember those who opened the gate for the Reds to enter the dawn and stayed behind to serve them." Snow had been falling heavily since early morning. Going out into the yard on the farther side of the dawn, Gregor saw a black crowd of people pouring towards the crossing. Horses harnessed in eights were dragging something, and he could hear talk, neighing, and curses. The gray figures of men and horses emerged through the falling snow as though through a mist. By the way the horses were harnessed up, Gregor guessed it was a battery. Surely not the Reds. His heart beat violently at the possibility, but on second thoughts he was reassured. The scattered crowd drew near the village, but at the crossing of the river, one wheel of the foremost gun broke through the ice at the edge. The wind carried the shouts of the drivers, the scrunch of the breaking ice, and the hurried, slipping stamp of the horses' hooves to Gregor's ears. He went into the cattle yard at the back of the hut and cautiously peered out. By their appearance he could now see they were Cossacks. A few minutes later, an elderly bombardier rode through the Myelyukov gate on a high, broad-backed horse. He dismounted at the steps, tied the reins to the balustrade, and entered the hut. "Who's the master here?" he asked after greeting the household. "I am," Panteleimon replied, anxiously awaiting the question, "And why are your Cossacks at home?" But the bombardier wiped his whiskers free of snow and pleaded, "For the love of Christ, help us to get our cannon out. It's gone into the river up to its axles, right by the bank. Have you any bullocks? What is this village? We've got lost owing to the snow, and the Reds are right on our tails." "I don't know." The old man hesitated. "What don't you know? You're fine Cossacks. We want men to give a hand." "I'm unwell," Panteleimon lied. The bombardier looked from one to another like a wolf, not turning his neck. His voice seemed to take on a more youthful and healthy tone. "Aren't you Cossacks? So you can let military property be lost? I'm left instead of the commander of the battery. The officers have all fled. For more than a week I've hardly been off my horse. I'm frozen. I've lost the toes of one foot through frostbite, but I won't desert my battery. And you, if you won't help us, I'll call my Cossacks and we'll—" Angrily yet tearfully he shouted, "We'll make you, you sons of bitches! Bolsheviks! We'll harness you up, old man, if that's what you want. Go and call some more men, and if they won't come, by God, we'll blow your village off the earth." He spoke like a man not quite confident of his own strength. Gregor felt sorry for him. He seized his sword and said harshly, without looking at the excited bombardier, "Don't shout so much. We'll help you out, and then go your way in peace." A large crowd was soon found ready to help. With the aid of the battery command, Anikushka, Tamilin, Christonia, the Myelyukovs, and a dozen women laid down wattle fences, lifted the field gun and the ammunition chests, and helped the horses get under way. The frozen wheels could not turn on their axles, but slid over the snow. The exhausted horses had difficulty in taking the least rise. The drivers, half demented, went on foot. The bombardier removed his cap and bowed, thanked those who had lent a hand, and, turning in his saddle, quietly ordered the battery to follow him. Gregor stared after him with a mingled gaze of respect and distrustful surprise. Pyotr approached, chewing his mustache, and, as though replying to Gregor's unspoken thought, remarked, "Now if they were all like that, that's the way to defend the gentle dawn." "Talking about that bombardier?" Christonia asked. "Look how he drags those guns about. I didn't want to help, but I got frightened. But tell me, what good are those guns to the fool? He's like a dangerous pig tied to a log. It's hard and no use to him, but he goes on dragging it about." Silently smiling, the Cossacks went their ways. Far beyond the dawn, it was now past dinner time, a machine gun muffledly stuttered out a couple of rounds, then was silent. Half an hour later, Gregor, who had spent all day at the window in the best room, stepped back, and his face turned an ashy pallor. "Here they come," he said. Ilinichna groaned and threw herself towards the window. 8 horsemen were galloping along the road. They reached the Melyakovs' yard, stared at the crossing over the Don, and turned back. Their well-fed horses waved their docked tails and threw up clumps of snow with their hoofs. Terrible as was this first moment of the arrival of the enemy troops, the risible Dunya could not restrain herself even then. When the patrol turned back, she snorted into her apron and ran into the kitchen. Natalia met her with a frightened stare. "What's the matter?" she asked. "Oh, Natalia, my dear, how they ride their horses! One man was wriggling backwards and forwards in the saddle, and his arms and elbows were knocking against his sides." So well did she imitate the Red Army men rolling in their saddles that Natalia ran, suppressing her laughter, to the bed and threw herself face downward on the pillow to avoid drawing down her mother-in-law's wrath upon her. Darya's eyebrows quivered with her nervous laughter, and she remarked between her outbursts, "I'm afraid they'll wear holes in their trousers, call themselves horsemen." Even Pyotr, who came gloomily in from the best room, was cheered for a moment by their merriment. "It's strange to watch the way they ride," he said, "but they don't mind. If they break one horse's back, they'll just take another, the peasants." He waved his hand in a gesture of ineffable contempt. An hour later, Tatarsk was filled with the sound of tramping feet, strange speech, and barking dogs. An infantry regiment with machine guns on sledges, transport wagons, and a field kitchen crossed the Don and poured into the village. The soldiers streamed down the streets, breaking into groups and entering the yards. 5 of them came through the Melyakov gate, led by a thick-set, elderly, clean-shaven man with flat, broad nostrils, evidently an old active service man. He halted at the steps for a moment, watching the dog barking and choking on its chain, then removed his rifle from his shoulder. The shot brought a white mist of snow down from the roof of the hut. Adjusting the tight collar of his shirt, through the window Gregor saw the dog rolling in the blood-stained snow, in its death throes, biting its wounded side and the iron chain. He saw the women's white faces, the vacant eyes of the mother. Hatless, he strode towards the porch. "Stop!" his father shouted after him in a strange voice. Gregor threw the front door open. "What did you shoot the dog for? It wasn't hurting you," he demanded, standing on the threshold. The broad nostrils of the Red Army man drew in deep gasps. The corners of his thin lips curled downward. He looked round and threw his rifle into the ready position. "What's that to do with you? You think it a pity? I'll put a bullet into you without any pity. Would you like me to?" Now, drop it, Alexander." A tall, red-haired Red Guard approached and said with a laugh, "Good afternoon, master. Ever seen Reds before? We want quarters. Did he shoot your dog? Quite unnecessary. Comrades, in you go." Gregor was the last to pass into the hut. He found the Red Army men cheerfully greeting its inhabitants, removing their packs and their Japanese leather cartridge belts, and throwing greatcoats, padded coats, and caps on the bed. The kitchen was at once filled with the evil-smelling, spirituous scent of soldiers, of human sweat, tobacco, cheap soap, gun grease, and long journeys. The man called Alexander sat down at the table, lit a cigarette, and, as though continuing a conversation, asked Gregor, "Have you been with the whites?" "Yes." "There, I can tell an owl at once by its flight, and you by your snot. A white. An officer, too, I suppose. Gold epaulets?" He sent the smoke in 2 columns out of his nostrils, turned cold, unsmiling eyes on Gregor standing at the door, and tapped his cigarette with tobacco-stained, swollen nails. "You've been an officer, haven't you? Admit it. I can see it by the way you hold yourself. I was in the German war myself." "Yes, I was an officer." Gregor smiled forcedly. Catching Natalia's terrified, imploring gaze fixed on him, he frowned, and his eyebrows quivered. He was vexed at his own smile. "Pity. It appears I shouldn't have shot the dog." The man threw the end of his cigarette at Gregor's feet and winked to his comrades. And again, despite his will, Gregor felt his lips twisting into a deprecatory, pleading smile, and he blushed with shame at his involuntary, uncontrollable manifestation of weakness. Like a well-schooled dog before its master, the thought burned into his mind, and for a moment he saw the dead dog's lips as they had used to writhe when he, the master, approached it, and its fluffy red tail wagging as it lay on its back. In the same unusual voice, Panteleimon asked, "Perhaps you would like some supper?" Without waiting for an answer, Ilinichna went towards the stove. The forked pole trembled in her hands, and she could hardly lift the pot of cabbage soup out of the oven with it. Her eyes downcast, Darya set the table. The Red Army men sat down without crossing themselves. The old man watched them in fear and secret disgust. At last he could restrain himself no longer and had to ask, "So you don't pray to God?" Only the faintest semblance of a smile flickered over Alexander's lips. Amid a roar of laughter from the others, he replied, "I wouldn't advise you to either, old man. We've sent our gods to the devil long since." He frowned. "There isn't any God, but fools don't believe that and go on praying to these bits of wood." Yes, educated people have, of course," Panteleimon hastened anxiously to agree. Darya had set out a spoon for each man, but Alexander thrust his away and asked, "Haven't you got any not made of wood? We don't want to catch any diseases. You don't call this a spoon, do you?" The Dawn Flows Home to the Sea, Part 1, by Mikhail Sholokhov, continued. Darya had set out a spoon for each man, but Alexander thrust his away and asked, "Haven't you got any not made of wood? We don't want to catch any diseases. You don't call this a spoon, do you?" Darya flared up. "You ought to carry your own if you don't like ours," she exclaimed. "You keep your mouth shut, young woman. You haven't got any others? Then give me a clean towel, and I'll wipe this one." Ilinichna brought the soup to the table in a bowl, and he asked her, "You try it first, Mother." "Why should I try it? Do you think it's too salt?" the old woman asked in alarm. "Taste it when you're told. Taste it. You may have put some powder or other into it for your guests. Take and try a spoonful. Now," Panteleimon ordered sternly and bit his lip. Then he brought an alder stump, which he used as a stool when mending boots, pushed it under the window, and sat on it, embracing an old boot. He took no more part in the conversation. Pyotr remained in the best room and did not show himself. Natalia also went and sat there with the children. Dunya stood huddled against the stove, knitting a stocking, but after one of the Red Army men had called her young lady and invited her to sup with them, she went out. The conversation died away. After eating, the guests lit cigarettes. "May we smoke?" one of them asked. Gregor refused the cigarette offered to him. He was inwardly trembling. His heart choked as he looked at the man who had shot the dog, and he maintained a challenging and insolent attitude to him. Evidently the man was looking for trouble, for he tried continually to draw Gregor into the conversation. "What regiment did you serve in, Your Excellency?" he asked. "In several." "How many of our people have you killed?" "There's no counting in wartime." "You needn't think, comrade, that I was born an officer. I earned my commission during the German war. They gave it to me for my war services." "I'm no comrade to officers. We put your sort up against a wall. I've aimed at more than one myself." "What I say is this, comrade. You're not behaving decently, acting as if you'd taken the village by storm. We ourselves deserted from the front and let you through, but you come as if you were entering a defeated country. Anyone can shoot a dog, and it's not clever to kill unarmed people or to be insulting either." "Don't you tell me what I'm to do. We know you. Deserted from the front. If we hadn't defeated you, you wouldn't have deserted, and I can talk to you how I like." "Shut up, Alexander. We've had enough of your voice," the red-haired man told him. But Alexander went right up to Gregor, dilating his nostrils and breathing heavily. "Better not upset me, officer, or it'll be the worse for you." "I'm not upsetting you?" "Yes, you are." Opening the door of the front room a little, Natalia called to Gregor. He walked round the man standing in front of him and swayed in the doorway as if drunk. Pyotr welcomed him with a baleful, groaning whisper. "What are you playing at? What did you answer him back for? You'll ruin yourself and us. Sit down." He thrust Gregor forcibly onto a chest and went into the kitchen. Gregor sat gasping in great mouthfuls of air. The heavy flush left his cheeks, and his eyes faintly glittered. "Gregor, dearest, don't get drawn into a quarrel," Natalia pleaded, trembling and putting her hands over the mouths of the children, who were on the point of bellowing. "Why didn't I clear out?" Gregor asked, looking mournfully at Natalia. "You needn't worry. I won't. But shut up. I can't stand any more." Later, 3 more Red Army soldiers arrived. One in a high black fur cap, evidently a commander, asked, "How many are quartered here?" 7 men, the red-haired man answered for them all. "We're putting a machine-gun outpost here. You'll have to make room for them." The 3 men went out. Immediately afterwards, the gate creaked and 2 wagons drove into the yard. One of the machine guns was dragged into the porch. Someone struck a match and cursed furiously in the darkness. The machine gunners smoked under the shed, pulled down hay, and lit fires in the threshing floor. But none of the hut's inhabitants went out to them. "Someone ought to go and see to the horses," Ilinichna whispered as she passed Panteleimon. But he only shrugged his shoulders and made no attempt to stir. All night doors were banging. The Red Army men made their beds on the floor in the front room. Gregor brought and spread rugs for them and put down his sheepskin coat as a pillow for their heads. "I've been in the army myself, and I know," he smiled pacifically at the man who regarded him as his enemy, but Alexander's broad nostrils dilated, and his eyes watched Gregor uncompromisingly. Gregor and Natalia lay down on the bed in the same room. The Red Army men put their rifles by their heads and huddled together on the rugs. Natalia wanted to put out the lamp, but they asked menacingly, "Who asked you to put the lamp out? Don't dare to touch it. Turn down the wick and the light should last all night." Natalia put the children to bed at her feet and lay against the wall without undressing. Gregor silently stretched himself out beside her. "If you'd cleared off," he thought, grinding his teeth, "if you'd gone off, they'd have had Natalia spread out on this bed now, and be taking their joy of her as the men did Frania in Poland." One of the Red Guards began to tell a story, but a familiar voice interrupted him, making challenging pauses in the semi-darkness. "Ah, it's a miserable life without women. But the master's an officer. He wouldn't give his wife up to us ordinary snotty-nosed folk. Do you hear, master?" The menacing voice of the red-haired man interrupted him. "Now, Alexander, I've had enough of trying to tell you. In every billet it's the same. You make a scene, behave like a hooligan, and bring discredit on the Red Army banner. It isn't good enough. I'm going straight to the commissar or the company commander. Do you hear? He'll have something to say to you." There was a dead silence, which was broken by the sound of the red-haired man drawing on his boots and snorting angrily. After a minute or 2, he went out, slamming the door behind him. Natalia could not restrain herself any longer and broke into a noisy whimper. With one shaking hand, Gregor stroked her head, her sweaty brow and wet face. With the other hand, he mechanically buttoned and unbuttoned her blouse. "Quiet, quiet," he whispered almost inaudibly to her. At that moment he knew beyond all doubt that he was ready for any trial and humiliation in order to save his own life and those of his dear ones. A match was struck and revealed Alexander sitting up and sucking at a cigarette. He grumbled in an undertone and began to dress. Gregor, impatiently straining his ears, in his soul boundlessly grateful to the red-haired man, trembled joyously when he heard steps under the window and an indignant voice. "And all the time he's trying to make trouble, Comrade Commissar." Steps sounded on the porch, and the door creaked as it was opened. Someone's voice ordered in a youthful tone of command, Alexander Tchurnikov, dress yourself and come out at once. You'll spend the night with me, and in the morning we'll try you for conduct unworthy of a Red Army soldier." Griegor's eyes met the stern gaze of a man in a black leather jerkin standing beside the red-haired man. He was obviously young and youthfully severe. His lips were compressed with unnecessary firmness. "So you've had a troublesome guest, comrade?" he asked Griegor, smiling faintly. "Well, now you can sleep. Tomorrow we'll quiet him down. Good night. Come on, Tchurnikov." They went out, and Griegor gave a sigh of relief. In the morning, when the red-haired man had paid for the night's quarters and provisions, he deliberately lingered behind and remarked, "Well, masters, don't be angry with us. That Alexander of ours is a little touched in the head. Last year some officers in Lugansk, he's a native of Lugansk, shot his mother and sister before his eyes. And that's why he's like that. Well, thank you. Goodbye. Why, I'd almost forgotten the children." To the twins' inexpressible delight, he pulled 2 dirty gray pieces of sugar out of his pack and thrust them into their hands. Panteleimon gazed at his grandchildren and, deeply moved, exclaimed, "There's a present for you. We haven't seen sugar for 18 months or more. God be with you, comrade. Bow to your uncle, children. Thank him, Polya. What are you standing dumb for?" The Red Army man went out, and the old man turned angrily to Natalia. "Don't you know how to behave? You should have given him a doughnut for his journey. We ought to repay the good man somehow." "Run after him," Griegor ordered her. Flinging her kerchief over her head, Natalia ran and overtook the man at the wicket gate. Reddening with confusion, she thrust a doughnut into the deep pocket of his greatcoat. At noonday, a Red Cavalry regiment passed at a forced march through the village, seizing the cavalry horses of some of the Cossacks as they went. Far from beyond the hill came the sound of gunfire. As evening came on, Pyotr and Griegor went out into the yard more than once. They could hear the roar of field guns and the quiet rattle of machine guns somewhere far beyond the dawn. "They're putting up a good fight over there," Pyotr remarked, brushing the snow from his knees and fur cap. Then he added inconsequentially, "They'll take our horses. They could see at once that your horse is a cavalry mount. They'll take it for sure." But the old man had already realized this. At nightfall, Griegor went to lead the 2 horses down to the river to drink. As he brought them out of the stable, he noticed that they were both limping on their forelegs. He went to fetch his brother. "The horses are maimed," he told him. "Yours on the right and mine on the left foreleg, and not a sign of a cut anywhere." The horses stood without stirring on the shadowed snow under the dim evening stars. Pyotr lit a lantern, but his father came out from the threshing floor and stopped him. "What's the lantern for?" "The horses have gone lame, father." "And that's no pity, is it? Or do you want some peasant to saddle them and ride them off?" "Well, isn't it bad, then?" "I did it. I took a hammer and drove a nail into their legs below the gristle, and now they'll limp until the reds have gone." Pyotr shook his head and chewed his mustache, but the old man's remedy saved the horses. That night the village was again alive with soldiers. Cavalry galloped along the streets, and batteries dragged past to be ranged in the square. Kristonia came along to the Myelyakovs, squatted down, and lit a cigarette. "Isn't anyone quartered on you?" he asked. "God has spared us so far. There were some here, and all the hut was filled with their peasant stink. That's why we call them stinking Russians, I suppose. The name fits them," Ilinichna muttered discontentedly. "They visited me." Kristonia's voice sank to a whisper, and his enormous palm wiped a little tear from his eyes, but he shook his head, groaned, and seemed ashamed of his tears. "Why, Kristonia, what's the matter?" Pyotr laughingly asked, for the first time in his life seeing Kristonia in tears. "They've taken my horse. I went through the German war on him. We suffered together. He was like a man and had more sense than a man. He used to saddle himself. 'Saddle,' I'd say to him, but he wouldn't take any notice. 'What,' I'd say, 'have I got to spend all my life saddling you? Get on with it yourself.' And he'd get the saddle onto his back." His voice passed into a swift, whistling whisper as he ended. "I'm afraid to look into the stable now. The yard's dead." Griegor pricked up his ears. Outside the window there was the scrunch of snow and the clatter of swords. "They're coming to us. Perhaps someone told them." Panteleimon fidgeted with his hands, not knowing what to do with them. "Master? Hey, come outside," a voice shouted. Pyotr threw his sheepskin coat across his shoulders and went out. "Where are your horses? Bring them out," he was ordered by the leader of 3 horsemen. "I don't mind, but they're lame, comrades." "Where are they lame? You bring them out. Don't be afraid, we won't take them if they are." Pyotr led the horses out one after the other. "You've got a third in there. Why haven't you brought it out too?" one of the men asked, shining the lantern into the stable. "She's a mare, and in foal. And she's old, 100 years old." "Hey, bring saddles." "Wait, you're right. They are lame. By Christ, where are you leading those cripples to? Take them back." The man holding the lantern roared furiously. Pyotr pulled on the halter ropes and turned his face with its twitching lips away from the light. "Where are your saddles?" "The comrades took them away this morning." "You're lying, Cossack. Who took them?" "God's truth! God strike me, they took them. A cavalry regiment passed through the village and took them. The saddles and 2 collars as well." The 3 horsemen rode away cursing. Smelling of horses' sweat and urine, Pyotr went into the hut. His firm lips quivered as he clapped Kristonia on the shoulder and bragged, "That's the way to do it. We lamed our horses, but they'd already taken the saddles." "Ah, you dolt." Ilinichna put out the lamp and went in the darkness to make the beds. "We'll sit in the dark, or the light may bring us some unwelcome visitors," she remarked. That night there was merrymaking at Anikushka's. The Red Guards quartered on him asked him to invite his Cossack neighbors in for a spree. Anikushka called for the Melyakovs. "They're Reds?" he asked. "Well, what if they are Reds? They've been baptized, haven't they? They're Russian, like us? By God, believe it or not, I'm sorry for them. There's a Jew among them, but he's a man, too. We killed off the Jews in Poland, I know, but this one gave me a glass of vodka. I like the Jews. Come on, Griegor. Pyotr." At first, Griegor refused to go, but his father advised him, "Go along, or they may say we think them lower than ourselves. Go on, don't bring up their past sins against them." Pyotr and Griegor went with Anikushka into the yard. The warm night promised fair weather. In the air was a scent of ashes and burning dung fuel. The 3 Cossacks stood for a moment in silence, then went on. At the wicket gate, Darya overtook them. Her arched, penciled eyebrows gleamed a velvety black in the dim light of the moon. "They're making my wife drunk," Anikushka muttered, "but they won't get what they want. I've got eyes." Tipsy with homemade vodka, he went reeling against the fence and stumbled off the path into a snowdrift. The blue, granular snow scrunched like sugar beneath their feet. The wind sent it whirling up from the ground. It flew rapaciously at the white clouds and the passive earth, covering the village, the tracks, the steppe, and all human and animal traces. In Anikushka's hut the air was so thick that it was impossible to breathe. Sharp black tongues of soot were winding up from the lamp, and nothing could be seen through the haze of tobacco smoke. Open jugs were standing on the table. The entire hut stank of liquor. The tablecloth was like a dirty rag. His long legs flung out in front of him, a Red Army accordion player was working the bellows of his instrument vigorously. Red Army men were sitting on the benches with women neighbors of Anikushka. Anikushka's own wife was being caressed by a healthy-looking old fellow in padded khaki trousers and boots loaded with enormous spurs that might have been taken from a museum. His cap was thrust on the back of his head, and his brown face was sweating. One moist hand was pressing the woman's back. She was already fuddled, and although she would have moved away if she could, she was without strength. She caught her husband's look and took no notice of the other women's smirks, but she was not strong enough to remove the powerful arm from her back. She sat laughing drunkenly and feebly. In the middle of the room, a cavalry troop commander, wearing breeches and chrome-yellow boots, was dancing and writhing like a green devil. Griegor stared from the threshold at the boots and breeches and thought, taken off an officer. He raised his eyes to the man's face. It was darkly swarthy, streaming with sweat. The large round ears protruded. The lips were thick and pendulous. A Jew, but smart on his feet, Griegor thought. They poured out homemade vodka for him and Pyotra. Griegor was careful how he drank, but Pyotra quickly got drunk, and within an hour he was doing the Cossack dance on the earthen floor, tearing up the dust with his heels, and hoarsely asking the accordion player to go faster. Griegor sat by the table cracking pumpkin seeds. Beside him was a machine gunner, a native of Siberia. "We've smashed Kolchak," he told Griegor. "Now we'll deal with your Krasnov as he deserves, and that will be the lot. And you can turn to your plowing, sow the land, and make it bear fruit. The earth's like a woman. It won't yield. You have to take what you want. And anyone who gets in the way we'll kill. We don't want your land. We only want to divide it up equally among everybody." Griegor assented, but all the while he was quietly studying the Red Army men. There seemed to be no cause for anxiety. They were all watching Pyotra, smiling approvingly as he displayed his skill in the dance. Someone's voice exclaimed rapturously, "There's a devil, that's fine!" But Griegor happened to catch the eyes of a curly-haired red soldier fixed attentively on him, and put on his guard, he drank no more. The accordion player struck up a polka. The Red Army men took their Cossack women by the arm. Swaying tipsily, one of them invited a young wife, a neighbor of Christonia's, to be his partner. But she refused, and picking up her skirt, ran across to Griegor. "Come and dance," she asked him. "I don't want to." "Come on, Griegor, my azure flower." "Don't be a fool, I won't." She dragged at him by the sleeve, forcedly laughing. He frowned and resisted, but noticing her wink, he yielded. After a couple of rounds, she took advantage of a lull in the dance to put her head on Griegor's shoulder and whisper almost inaudibly, "They're planning to kill you. Someone told them you're an officer. Get out of here." Then she added aloud, "Oh, my head's swimming." Griegor took her to a seat, then strode swiftly across to the table and drank a cup of vodka. He turned to ask Darya, "Pyotra's drunk?" "Almost." "Get him home." Darya led Pyotra out with masculine strength, resisting his pushing and stumbling. Griegor followed them. "Hey, where are you off to?" "No, don't go." Anikushka ran after Griegor, but he gave him such a glance that Anikushka unlinked his arm and staggered off. At the threshold, Griegor waved his cap. "Honest company," he muttered. The curly-haired Red Guard adjusted his belt and followed Griegor. On the steps, breathing in his face, the man whispered, "Where are you going?" He seized the sleeve of Griegor's greatcoat. "Home," Griegor replied without stopping, dragging the man after him. With joyous excitement, he resolved, "You don't take me alive." Breathing heavily, holding Griegor's elbow with his left hand, the Red Guard walked at his side. They halted at the wicket gate. Griegor heard the door scrape behind them, and at the same moment he noticed the Red Guard's right hand pawing at his side, and heard his fingernails scratch the holster of his revolver. For 1 second, Griegor saw the man's hostile eyes fixed on his face. He turned and seized the hand tearing upon the holster flap. Gripping it by the wrist with terrible strength, he drew the man's arm over his right shoulder, stooped, and with all his old skill flung the heavy body across his back and dragged the hand downward. He heard the crunching sound of the elbow joint cracking. The man's head slipped downward, touched the snow, and was buried in a drift. Bending low behind the fences, Griegor ran along a side lane towards the dawn. He ran springily, making for the point where the road dropped down to the bank. So long as there isn't an outpost there, he thought. He halted for a moment. Behind him, all Anikushka's yard lay open to view. He heard a shot. The bullet whistled rapaciously past him. More shots. Under the hill, across the dawn, he decided. When he was in the middle of the crossing, a bullet whistled close to him and buried itself in the ice sending fragments flying. From the farther side of the river he looked back. The shots were still sounding like a drover's whip. He felt no warmth of gladness at his escape, but was oppressed with a feeling of indifference to all that had happened. They might have been hunting an animal, he thought mechanically as he halted again. They won't search for me. They'll be afraid to come into the forest. I gave his arm something to remember me by. The scum, he thought he could take a Cossack with bare hands. He made his way towards the winter ricks, but apprehensively avoided them, and like a hare wound a long entanglement of tracks. He decided to spend the night in an abandoned rick of dry bulrushes. He dug into the top. A mink slipped away from his feet. He burrowed up to his head in the rotten-smelling bulrushes and rested shivering. His mind was without thought or plan. The merest suggestion of an idea flickered through his head: saddle the horse tomorrow and get through the front to my own side. But he could find no answer in himself and lay quietly. Towards morning he began to freeze. He looked out. Above him the early morning light was glimmering joyously, and in the deep abysm of the blue-black heaven, as though in the shallows of the dawn, a bottom seemed to appear, an early smoky azure in the zenith, and a fading sprinkle of stars around the edges. Chapter 12. The front passed on beyond Tatarsk. The noise of war died away. On the last day troops were quartered in the village. The machine gunners of a cavalry regiment set Mochov's phonograph on a broad sledge and galloped their horses up and down the street. The phonograph wheezed and grumbled. The horses' hoofs sent the snow flying into its broad horn. The machine gunners hurriedly cleaned the horn and turned the crank as confidently as they handled their machine gun. Like a gray flock of sparrows, the village urchins poured after them, clinging to the sledge and shouting, "Daddy, play the thing that whistles. More, Daddy." Two supremely fortunate lads were seated on a machine gunner's knees, and when he was not turning the phonograph crank, he was carefully and firmly wiping the younger boy's streaming nose. Afterwards, as the sounds of struggle faded, transport wagons dragged slowly through Tatarsk, serving the Red Army on the southern front with provisions and munitions. On the third day, messengers went from hut to hut, calling on the Cossacks to attend a village assembly. "We're going to elect Krasnov ataman," one jesting Cossack remarked to Panteleimon. "Shall we be allowed to elect an ataman, or will they appoint one from above?" Panteleimon inquired. "We shall see." Griegor and Pyotr went to the assembly. The younger Cossacks were present to a man. The old men stayed away. Only Avdyeich the braggart had gathered a little circle of Cossacks around him, and was telling how a Red Commissar had spent the night with him, and had invited him to accept an important position. The Cossacks gathered in little groups in the square. Griegor had not seen his old friend Misha Koshevoy since the spring mobilization, and noticing him, he went up, shook his hand, and asked with a smile, "Hallo, Mishka, where did you disappear to? Under whose flag have you been serving?" "Oh-ho. First I was working as a drover, then they drafted me into the disciplinary company on the Kolchak front," Mishka replied. "I got away and came home to join the Reds at the front, but they watched me closer than a mother keeps an eye on an untried daughter. Then the other day Ivan Alexeyevich came up to me all dressed in uniform and says, 'Get your rifle ready and come on.' I had only just come home, and I asked him, 'Surely you're not clearing out?' He shrugged his shoulders and said, 'I hear they're going to send us an ataman,' said goodbye and went. I thought he really had cleared out, but the next day a Red regiment marches into the village, and I see him with them. Why, there he is now. 'Ivan Alexeyevich!' he shouted across the square. Ivan came up, the mill hand David with him. He squeezed Griegor's hand in his own oily fingers and clicked his tongue. "How is it that you stayed behind, Griegor? And how about you?" "Well, it's different in my case." "Thinking of my commission?" Griegor asked. "I risked it and stayed on here. I was all but killed yesterday, The Reds chased me and began to shoot at me, and I was sorry I hadn't cleared out, but now I'm not sorry. What was it all about? I was at Anikushka's, and someone told them I was an officer. I fled across to the other side of the Don, after giving one of them something to remember me by. In return, they went to our hut and took everything, trousers, coats, and all. I'm left with what I stand up in. We should have cleared off to the Reds when we had the chance, Ivan Alexeyevich smiled sourly and began to smoke. The meeting began. It was opened by an ensign from Vyashenska, one of Fomin's men. Comrade Cossacks, the Soviet government has taken root in our district. Now we must set up an administration, elect an executive committee, a chairman and a vice-chairman. That's the first question. And then I've brought an order from the regional Soviet that all firearms and other weapons are to be surrendered. Fine, someone at the back said venomously. There was a long silence. There's no call for that sort of remark, comrades. The ensign drew himself up and set his fur cap down on the table. Of course the weapons must be given up, as you don't want them for your home needs. If anyone wants to help in the defense of the Soviets, he will be given weapons. All rifles must be brought in within 3 days. And now we'll hold the election. They gave us our weapons. What are they wanting to lay their hands on them for now? The speaker had not finished his remark when all eyes were turned on him. It was Zakhar Korolyov. And what do you want to keep them for? Kristonia asked simply. I don't want them, but when we let the Red Army into our province, there was no agreement that they should disarm us. That's true, and we've kept our swords in good order at our own cost. I came back with my rifle from the German war, and now have I got to give it up? They want to pillage us. What can we do without our arms? Without them, I'm like a woman with a torn skirt. I'm naked. Mishka Koshevoy demanded to be heard and shouted, Enough of this, comrades! I'm surprised to hear you talking like that. Is there a state of war in this district, or isn't there? And if there is, there's no point in talking over the matter. Hand them over. Didn't we make the Ukrainians do the same when we occupied their villages? The ensign stared at his fur cap and said emphatically, Anyone who doesn't give up his arms within 3 days will be handed over to a revolutionary court and shot as a counter-revolutionary. After a momentary silence, Tamilin coughed and called out, Let's get on with the election. Some dozen names altogether were put forward. One of the youngsters called out Avdyeich, but the joke fell flat. The name of Ivan Alexeyevich was the first to be put to the vote, and he was elected unanimously. As the Melyakov brothers and Kristonia were returning to their huts after the meeting, they met Anikushka on the road. Under his arm he was carrying his rifle and cartridges wrapped up in one of his wife's aprons. When he saw the Cossacks, he was taken aback and disappeared into a side turning. Pyotr looked at Gregor at Kristonia, and with one accord they all smiled. Chapter 13. An easterly wind raged over the steppe. The snow had leveled out the hollows and depressions. Neither roads nor tracks were visible. In all directions stretched the bare, white, wind-swept plain. The steppe was dead. Occasionally a crow, as ancient as the steppe itself, flew high over the snow, calling as it flew. The wind carried its cry far across the steppe, and long and mournfully it sounded, like a bass string accidentally plucked in the nocturnal silence. But beneath the snow, the steppe was still alive. Where the plowed land lay in frozen waves of silver snow, where the earth had been wrapped in dead ripples since the autumn, there, gripping the soil with greedy, living roots, lay the winter rye under the frosts. Silkily green, all in tears of frozen dew, it feebly pressed against the crumbling black earth, feeding on its vital black blood, and waiting for spring, for the sun, in order to rise, to break through the fine, diamond-studded snowy crust, and to spring up a vigorous green in May. And it would rise in its time. The quails would struggle in it, the April lark would sing above it, the sun would shine on it, and the wind send it swaying, until the ripe, full ears were laid low by the scythe of the master, and humbly cast their grain down on the threshing floor. All the Don district was living a secret, crushed existence. Dreary days had arrived. A somber rumor crawled from the upper reaches of the Don, down its tributaries, along the Chira, the Khoper, the Yelanka, along the large and small rivers sprinkled with Cossack villages. It was said that the front, which had rolled on and come to a halt at the Donets River, was in the terrible grip of extraordinary commissions and tribunals. It was said that any day they would arrive in the Cossack districts, that they had already appeared in Migulin and Kazanska districts, and were holding brief and illegal trials of the Cossacks who had served with the whites. Seemingly, the fact that the Upper Don Cossacks had themselves deserted from the front was not accepted in their defense, and the court procedure was terrifyingly simple: an accusation, a couple of questions, sentence, and then machine-gun death. It was said that already in Kazanska and Shumilinsk many a Cossack head was rolling neglected in the brushwood. The front-line men only laughed. Lies, officers' stories. The cadets have always tried to frighten us with similar yarns, they jested. In Tatarsk, the Cossacks gathered of an evening in the side lanes, sharing the news, then going to drink homemade vodka, wandering from hut to hut. Quietly and bitterly the village lived. At Shrovetide, only one wedding sent the sleigh bells ringing. Mishka Koshevoy gave his sister in marriage, and of this wedding the neighbors talked with spiteful sneers. Fine time to get married, this is. A case of had to, I expect. The day following the elections, the village was disarmed hut by hut. The warm porches and corridors of Mokhov's house, now occupied by the Revolutionary Committee, were plied with weapons. Pyotr Melyakov handed in his and Griegor's rifles, 2 revolvers and a sword, but he gave up only those weapons they had brought back from the German war, and kept their officers' revolvers. Pyotr returned home with a feeling of relief. He found Griegor in the porch, his sleeves turned up to his elbows, taking the rusty parts of 2 rifles to pieces and cleaning them with paraffin. "Where the devil have you got them from?" Pyotr's mustache drooped in his astonishment. "Father brought them back when he visited me at Filanova." Griegor's eyes glittered, and he roared with laughter, smacking his sides with his paraffin-stained hands. As unexpectedly, his laugh died away, and he showed his teeth wolfishly. "Rifles, that's nothing. Do you know?" His voice dropped to a whisper, although there was no stranger in the hut. "Do you know, today Father told me he's got a machine gun?" Griegor's lips again parted in a smile. "You're lying. Where did he get it? What's it for?" "He says some transport Cossacks gave it to him for some sour milk. But I think he's lying, the old devil. He stole it, I expect. He's like a beetle. He drags away everything he can carry off. He whispered to me, 'I've got a machine gun buried in the threshing floor. The spring would have made fine hooks, but I didn't touch it.' 'What did you want the gun for?' I asked him. 'I took a fancy to the spring,' he answered. 'I thought it might be useful for something.'" Pyotr was furious and wanted to go and talk to his father about it, but Griegor dissuaded him. "Wait a bit. Help me clean these and put them together. What will you say to him?" Pyotr snorted as he cleaned the rifle bolt, but after a moment he said thoughtfully, "Maybe he's right. It might come in useful. Let it lie there." That day, Ivan Tomilin called to pass on the rumor that shootings were going on in Kazanska. They sat smoking and talking around the stove. During the conversation, Pyotr sat with knitted brows, thinking hard. When Tomilin had gone, he remarked, "I'll drive to Ryubezhin and see Yakov Fomin. I hear he's back home. They say he's organizing the Regional Revolutionary Committee. I'll go and ask him to step in if anything should happen." While Panteleimon was harnessing the mare to the sledge, Darya wrapped herself in a new sheepskin and whispered to Ilinichna. The 2 women went together into the granary and brought back a bundle. "What's that?" the old man asked. Pyotr was silent, but Ilinichna hurriedly whispered, "I've got some butter saved up here, which I've kept in case we needed it. But this isn't the time to think of butter, so I've given it to Darya. Let her take a present to Fomin, and maybe he'll listen to Pyotr." She burst into tears. "They've served and earned their way to offices, and now others are staring at their epaulets." "Stop your whining!" Panteleimon angrily threw the whip into the bottom of the sledge and went across to Pyotr. "Take some wheat for him, too," he said. "What the devil should he want wheat for?" Pyotr burst out. "It would be better if you went to Anikushka and bought some vodka for him, but wheat—" Panteleimon at once went off, returning a few minutes later with a great jug of vodka under his arm. As he set it down, he remarked approvingly, "It's good vodka, as good as that of Tsarist days." "He's been tasting it, the old hound." Ilinichna went for him. But apparently the old man did not hear her, for he limped youthfully into the hut, wiping his lips with his sleeve and screwing up his eyes satisfiedly. In addition to the vodka, Pyotr took a piece of pre-war Cheviot tweed, a pair of boots, and a pound of expensive tea as presents for his former fellow-soldier, who had now grown so powerful. All these things and much else had been his share of the booty when the 28th Regiment had captured the railway station at Liesk and had looted the wagons and warehouses. He had sent them back by his father when the old man visited the front. When Panteleimon returned home, Darya had aroused the envy of Natalia and Dunya by adorning herself in underlinen never seen before in the village. It was made of the finest foreign linen, whiter than snow, and every little article was embroidered with arms and initials. The lace of her knickers was finer than the foam on the dawn. The first night after Pyotr's return from Vyeshenska, she had gone to bed in her knickers. Before putting out the light, Pyotr had smiled condescendingly. "So you've got hold of some men's pants to wear," he remarked. "It's warmer and nicer in them," Darya replied dreamily. "What makes you think they're men's? They'd be longer if they were. And besides, what do men want lace for?" "I expect lords wear lace on their pants, but I don't care. Wear them if you want to," Pyotr replied sleepily, scratching himself. But when he lay down at his wife's side the next night, he drew away in alarm, staring with involuntary respect and uneasiness at the lace, afraid to touch it, and feeling that Darya was alienated from him. On the third night he grew angry and demanded in a tone that brooked no refusal, "Take your trousers off and chuck them to the devil. They're not fit for women to wear, and they're not women's clothes. You're lying there like a lady. You're not the same woman in them." Next morning he rose before Darya and, coughing and frowning, tried the knickers on himself. He stared long and doubtfully at the silk ties, at the lace and his own legs, bare and hairy below the knees. Turning round, he happened to catch a glimpse of himself in the mirror, with the knickers puckered in elegant folds at the back, and spat and cursed as he crawled like a bear out of the garment. His great toe caught in the lace. He all but fell over onto the chest, and, now really furious, tore off the ties and escaped into freedom. Darya sleepily asked, "What are you doing?"